free will as the ability of agents to make choices unconstrained by certain factors. Factors of historical concern have included metaphysical constraints, physical constraints, social constraints, and mental constraints. The principle of free will has religious, legal, ethical, and scientific implications. For example, in the religious realm, free will implies that individual will and choices can coexist with an omnipotent, omniscient divinity. In the law, it affects considerations of punishment and rehabilitation. In ethics, it may hold implications for whether individuals can be held morally accountable for their actions. In science, neuroscientific findings regarding free will may suggest different ways of predicting human behavior. Though it is a commonly held intuition that we have free will, it has been widely debated throughout history not only whether that is true, but even how to define the concept of free will. How exactly must the will be free, what exactly must the will be free from, in order for us to have free will? Historically, the constraint of dominant concern has been determinism of some variety, so the most prominent common positions are named for the relation they hold to exist between free will and determinism. Those who define free will as freedom from determinism are called incompatibilists, as they hold determinism to be incompatible with free will. The two main incompatibilist positions are metaphysical libertarianism, the claim that determinism is false and thus free will is at least possible, and hard determinism, the claim that determinism is true and thus free will is not possible. Hard incompatibilism posits that indeterminism is also incompatible with free will, and thus either way free will is not possible. Those who define free will otherwise, without reference to determinism, are called compatibilists, because they hold determinism to be compatible with free will. Some compatibilists hold even that determinism is necessary for free will, arguing that choice involves preference for one course of action over another, a process that requires some sense of how choices will turn out. Compatibilists thus consider the debate between libertarians and hard determinists over free will versus determinism a false dilemma. Different compatibilists offer very different definitions of what free will even means, taking different types of constraints to be relevant to the issue. But because all agree that determinism is not the relevant concern, they are traditionally grouped together under this common name. In Western philosophy, the underlying issue is, do we have some control over our actions, and if so, what sort of control, what extent? On one hand, humans have a strong sense of freedom, which leads us to believe that we have free will. On the other hand, an intuitive feeling of free will could be mistaken. It is difficult to reconcile the intuitive evidence that conscious decisions are causally effective with the scientific view that the physical world can be explained to operate perfectly by physical law. The conflict between intuitively felt freedom and natural law arises when either causal closure or physical determinism is asserted. With causal closure, no physical event has a cause outside the physical domain, and with physical determinism, the future is determined entirely by preceding events. The need to reconcile freedom of will with a deterministic universe is known as the problem of free will or sometimes referred to as the dilemma of determinism. This dilemma leads to a moral dilemma as well: how are we to assign responsibility for our actions if they are caused entirely by past events? The connection between autonomy and the ideal of developing a neo-Euro-unregistered trademark's own individual self was adopted within the psychology of Abraham Maslow, who saw the goal of human development as a Euro-OE self-actualization. For Maslow, the most developed person is the most autonomous, and autonomy is explicitly associated with not being dependent on others. For others, true free will must involve self-realization, which is a maturing of the self that allows the dissolution of one's counterproductive obsessive, internal preoccupations and assumptions, including unrecognized peer pressure and the like, all of which reduce our actual choices, thus reduce our freedom. Classical compatibilists have addressed the dilemma of free will by arguing that free will holds as long as we are not externally constrained or coerced. Modern compatibilists make a distinction between freedom of will and freedom of action, that is, separating freedom of choice from the freedom to enact it. Given that humans all experience a sense of free will, some modern compatibilists think it is necessary to accommodate this intuition. For example, Some modern compatibilists in psychology have tried to revive traditionally accepted struggles of free will with the formation of character. Compatibilist free will has also been attributed to our natural sense of agency, where one must believe they are an agent in order to function and develop a theory of mind. A different approach to the dilemma is that of incompatibilists, namely, that if the world is deterministic then, our feeling that we are free to choose an action is simply an illusion. Fundamental debate continues over whether the physical universe is in fact deterministic. Physical models offered at present are both deterministic and indeterministic, and are subject to interpretations of quantum mechanics, which themselves are being constrained by ongoing experimentation. Yet even with physical indeterminism, arguments have been made against the feasibility of incompatibilist free will in that it is difficult to assign origination. Despite our attempts to understand nature, a complete understanding of reality remains open to philosophical speculation. For example, the laws of physics have yet to resolve the hard problem of consciousness. Solving the hard problem of consciousness involves determining how physiological processes such as ions flowing across the nerve membrane cause us to have experiences. According to some, intricately related to the hard problem of consciousness, the hard problem of free will represents the core problem of conscious free will. Does conscious volition impact the material world? Although incompatibilist metaphysical libertarianism generally represents the bulk of non-materialist constructions, including the popular claim of being able to consciously veto an action or competing desire, compatibilist theories have been developed based on a form of identity dualism in which the experience of conscious free will is the first-person perspective of the neural correlates of choosing. It is however apparent that, even disregarding the hard problem of consciousness plays a far smaller role in human life than Western culture has tended to believe. Free will here is predominantly treated with respect to physical determinism in the strict sense of nomological determinism, although other forms of determinism are also relevant to free will. For example, logical and theological determinism challenge metaphysical libertarianism with ideas of destiny and fate, and biological, cultural and psychological determinism feed the development of compatibilist models. Separate classes of compatibilism and incompatibilism may even be formed to represent these. Below are the classic arguments bearing upon the dilemma and its underpinnings. Incompatibilism. Incompatibilism is the position that free will and determinism are logically incompatible, and that the major question regarding whether or not people have free will is thus whether or not their actions are determined. Hard determinists, such as Dolbach, are those incompatibilists who accept determinism and reject free will. In contrast, metaphysical libertarians, such as Thomas Reid, Peter van Inwagen, and Robert Kane, are those incompatibilists who accept free will and deny determinism, holding the view that some form of indeterminism is true. Another view is that of hard incompatibilists, which state that free will is incompatible with both determinism and indeterminism. Traditional arguments for incompatibilism are based on an intuition pump. If a person is like other mechanical things that are determined in their behavior, such as a wind-up toy, a billiard ball, a puppet, or a robot, then people must not have free will. This argument has been rejected by compatibilists such as Daniel Dennett on the grounds that, even if humans have something in common with these things, it remains possible and plausible that we are different from such objects in important ways. Another argument for incompatibilism is that of the causal chain. Incompatibilism is key to the idealist theory of free will. Most incompatibilists reject the idea that freedom of action consists simply in voluntary behavior. They insist, rather, that free will means that man must be the ultimate, or originating cause of his actions. He must be causa sui, in the traditional phrase. Being responsible for one's choices is the first cause of those choices, where first cause means that there is no antecedent cause of that cause. The argument, then, is that if man has free will, then man is the ultimate cause of his actions. If determinism is true, then all of man's choices are caused by events and facts outside his control. So, if everything man does is caused by events and facts outside his control, then he cannot be the ultimate cause of his actions. Therefore, he cannot have free will. This argument has also been challenged by various compatibilist philosophers. A third argument for incompatibilism was formulated by Carl Ginet in the 1960s and has received much attention in the modern literature. The simplified argument runs along these lines: if determinism is true, then we have no control over the events of the past that determined our present state and no control over the laws of nature. Since we can have no control over these matters, we also can have no control over the consequences of them. Since our present choices and acts, under determinism, are the necessary consequences of the past and the laws of nature, then we have no control over them and, hence, no free will. This is called the consequence argument. Peter van Inwagen remarks that C.D. Broad had a version of the consequence argument as early as the 1930s. The difficulty of this argument for some compatibilists lies in the fact that it entails the impossibility that one could have chosen other than one has. For example, if Jane is a compatibilist and she has just sat down on the sofa, then she is committed to the claim that she could have remained standing, if she had so desired. But it follows from the consequence argument that, if Jane had remained standing, she would have either generated a contradiction, violated the laws of nature or changed the past. Hence, compatibilists are committed to the existence of incredible abilities, according to Ginet and van Inwagen. One response to this argument is that it equivocates on the notions of abilities and necessities, or that the free will evoked to make any given choice is really an illusion and the choice had been made all along, oblivious to its decider. David Lewis suggests that compatibilists are only committed to the ability to do something otherwise if different circumstances had actually obtained in the past. Using T, F for true, and false, and for undecided, there are exactly 9 positions regarding determinism free will that consist of any 2 of these 3 possibilities. Incompatibilism may occupy any of the 9 positions except, or, which last corresponds to soft determinism. Position is hard determinism, and position is libertarianism. The position of hard determinism adds to the table the contention that D implies FW is untrue, and the position of libertarianism adds the contention that FW implies D is untrue. Position may be called hard incompatibilism if one interprets as meaning both concepts are of dubious value. Compatibilism itself may occupy any of the 9 positions, that is, there is no logical contradiction between determinism and free will, and either or both may be true or false in principle. However, the most common meaning attached to compatibilism is that some form of determinism is true and yet we have some form of free will, position. Alex Rosenberg makes an extrapolation of physical determinism as inferred on the macroscopic scale by the behavior of a set of dominoes to neural activity in the brain where, if the brain is nothing but a complex physical object whose states are as much governed by physical laws as any other physical object, then what goes on in our heads is as fixed and determined by prior events as what goes on when one domino topples another in a long row of them. Physical determinism is currently disputed by prominent interpretations of quantum mechanics, and while not necessarily representative of intrinsic indeterminism in nature, fundamental limits of precision in measurement are inherent in the uncertainty principle. The relevance of such prospective indeterminate activity to free will is however contested, even when chaos theory is introduced to magnify the effects of such microscopic events. Below these positions are examined in more detail. Hard determinism. Determinism is a broad term with a variety of meanings. Corresponding to each of these different meanings, there arises a different problem for free will. Hard determinism is the claim that determinism is true, and that it is incompatible with free will, so free will does not exist. Although hard determinism generally refers to nomological determinism, it can include all forms of determinism that necessitate the future in its entirety. Relevant forms of determinism include causal determinism, the idea that everything is caused by prior conditions, making it impossible for anything else to happen. In its most common form, nomological determinism, future events are necessitated by past and present events combined with the laws of nature. Such determinism is sometimes illustrated by the thought experiment of Laplace's demon. Imagine an entity that knows all facts about the past and the present, and knows all natural laws that govern the universe. If the laws of nature were determinate, then such an entity would be able to use this knowledge to foresee the future, down to the smallest detail. Logical determinism the notion that all propositions, whether about the past, present or future, are either true or false. The problem of free will, in this context, is the problem of how choices can be free, given that what one does in the future is already determined as true or false in the present. Theological determinism the idea that the future is already determined either by a creator deity decreeing or knowing its outcome in advance. The problem of free will, in this context, is the problem of how our actions can be free if there is a being who has determined them for us in advance, or if they are already set in time. Other forms of determinism are more relevant to compatibilism, such as biological determinism, the idea that all behaviors, beliefs, and desires are fixed by our genetic endowment and our biochemical makeup, the latter of which is affected by both genes and environment, cultural determinism and psychological determinism. Combinations and syntheses of determinist theses, such as bioenvironmental determinism, are even more common. Suggestions have been made that hard determinism need not maintain strict determinism, where something near to, like that informally known as adequate determinism, is perhaps more relevant. Despite this, hard determinism has grown less popular in present times, given scientific suggestions that determinism is false yet the intention of their position is sustained by hard incompatibilism. Metaphysical libertarianism. Metaphysical libertarianism is one philosophical viewpoint under that of incompatibilism. Libertarianism holds on to a concept of free will that requires that the agent be able to take more than one possible course of action under a given set of circumstances. Accounts of libertarianism subdivide into non-physical theories and physical or naturalistic theories. Non-physical theories hold that the events in the brain that lead to the performance of actions do not have an entirely physical explanation, which requires that the world is not closed under physics. This includes interactionist dualism, which claims that some non-physical mind, will, or soul overrides physical causality. Physical determinism implies there is only one possible future and is therefore not compatible with libertarian free will. As consequent of incompatibilism, metaphysical libertarian explanations that do not involve dispensing with physicalism require physical indeterminism, such as probabilistic subatomic particle behavior theory unknown to many of the early writers on free will. Incompatibilist theories can be categorized based on the type of indeterminism they require. Uncaused events, non-deterministically caused events, and agent-substance caused events. Non-causal theories, non-causal accounts of incompatibilist free will do not require a free action to be caused by either an agent or a physical event. They either rely upon a world that is not causally closed, or physical indeterminism. Non-causal accounts often claim that each intentional action requires a choice or volition a willing, trying, or endeavoring on behalf of the agent. Such intentional actions are interpreted as free actions. It has been suggested however that such acting cannot be said to exercise control over anything in particular. According to non-causal accounts, the causation by the agent cannot be analyzed in terms of causation by mental states or events, including desire, belief, intention of something in particular, but rather is considered a matter of spontaneity and creativity. The exercise of intent in such intentional actions is not that which determines their freedom. Intentional actions are rather self-generating. The actish feel of some intentional actions do not constitute that event's activeness, or the agent's exercise of active control, rather they might be brought about by direct stimulation of someone's brain, in the absence of any relevant desire or intention on the part of that person. Another question raised by such non-causal theory, is how an agent acts upon reason, if the said intentional actions are spontaneous. Some non-causal explanations involve invoking panpsychism, the theory that a quality of mind is associated with all particles, and pervades the entire universe, in both animate and inanimate entities. Event-causal theories, event-causal accounts of incompatibilist free will typically rely upon physicalist models of mind, yet they presuppose physical indeterminism, in which certain indeterministic events are said to be caused by the agent. A number of event-causal accounts of free will have been created, referenced here as deliberative indeterminism, centered accounts, and efforts of will theory. The first two accounts do not require free will to be a fundamental constituent of the universe. Ordinary randomness is appealed to as supplying the elbow room that libertarians believe necessary. A first common objection to event-causal accounts is that the indeterminism could be destructive and could therefore diminish control by the agent rather than provide it. A second common objection to these models is that it is questionable whether such indeterminism could add any value to deliberation over that which is already present in a deterministic world. Deliberative indeterminism asserts that the indeterminism is confined to an earlier stage in the decision process. This is intended to provide an indeterminate set of possibilities to choose from, while not risking the introduction of luck. The selection process is deterministic, although it may be based on earlier preferences established by the same process. Deliberative indeterminism has been referenced by Daniel Dennett and John Martin Fisher. An obvious objection to such a view is that agent cannot be assigned ownership over their decisions to any greater degree than that of a compatibilist model. Centered accounts propose that for any given decision between two possibilities, the strength of reason will be considered for each option, yet there is still a probability the weaker candidate will be chosen. An obvious objection to such a view is that decisions are explicitly left up to chance, and origination or responsibility cannot be assigned for any given decision. Efforts of will theory is related to the role of willpower in decision-making. It suggests that the indeterminacy of agent volition processes could map to the indeterminacy of certain physical events, and the outcomes of these events could therefore be considered caused by the agent. Models of volition have been constructed in which it is seen as a particular kind of complex, high-level process with an element of physical indeterminism. An example of this approach is that of Robert Kane, where he hypothesizes that, in each case, the indeterminism is functioning as a hindrance or obstacle to her realizing one of her purposes, a hindrance or obstacle in the form of resistance within her will which must be overcome by effort. According to Robert Kane, such ultimate responsibility is a required condition for free will. An important factor in such a theory is that the agent cannot be reduced to physical neuronal events, but rather mental processes are said to provide an equally valid account of the determination of outcome as their physical processes. Although at the time quantum mechanics was only in the initial stages of acceptance, in his book Miracles, a preliminary study, C.S. Lewis stated the logical possibility that if the physical world were proved indeterministic, this would provide an entry point to describe an action of a non-physical entity on physical reality. Indeterministic physical models introduce random occurrences at an atomic or subatomic level. These events might affect brain activity, and could seemingly allow incompatibilist free will if the apparent indeterminacy of some mental processes map to the underlying indeterminacy of the physical construct. This relationship, however, requires a causative role over probabilities that is questionable, and it is far from established that brain activity responsible for human action can be affected by such events. Secondarily, these incompatibilist models are dependent upon the relationship between action and conscious volition, as studied in the neuroscience of free will. It is evident that observation may disturb the outcome of the observation itself, rendering limited our ability to identify causality. Niels Bohr, one of the main architects of quantum theory, suggested however that no connection could be made between indeterminism of nature and freedom of will. Agent-substance causal theories, agent-substance causal accounts of incompatibilist free will rely upon substance dualism in their description of mind. The agent is assumed power to intervene in the physical world. Agent, substance, causal accounts have been suggested by both George Berkeley and Thomas Reid. It is required that what the agent causes is not causally determined by prior events. It is also required that the agent's causing of that event is not causally determined by prior events. A number of problems have been identified this view. Firstly, it is difficult to establish the reason for any given choice by the agent, which suggests they may be random or determined by luck. Secondly, it has been questioned whether physical events can be caused by an external substance or mind, a common problem associated with interactionalist dualism. Hard incompatibilism, Hard incompatibilism is defended by Dirk Perboom, who identifies a variety of positions where free will is seen irrelevant to indeterminism, among them the following. Determinism is true, D does not imply we lack free will, but in fact we do lack F. D is true, D does not imply we lack F, but in fact we don't know if we have F. D is true, and we do have F. D is true, we have F, and F implies D. D is unproven, but we have F. D isn't true, we do have F, and would have F even if D were true. D isn't true, we don't have F, but F is compatible with D. Dirk Perboom, Living Without Free Will, PXVI. Perboom calls positions 3 and 4 soft determinism, position 1 a form of hard determinism, position 6 a form of classical libertarianism, and any position that includes having F as compatibilism. He largely ignores position 2. John Locke denied that the phrase free will made any sense. He also took the view that the truth of determinism was irrelevant. He believed that the defining feature of voluntary behavior was that individuals have the ability to postpone a decision long enough to reflect or deliberate upon the consequences of a choice. The will in truth signifies nothing but a power, or ability, to prefer or choose. The contemporary philosopher Galen Strawson agrees with Locke that the truth or falsity of determinism is irrelevant to the problem. He argues that the notion of free will leads to an infinite regress and is therefore senseless. According to Strawson, if one is responsible for what one does in a given situation, then one must be responsible for the way one is in certain mental respects. But it is impossible for one to be responsible for the way one is in any respect. This is because to be responsible in some situation S, one must have been responsible for the way one was at ZAR 1. To be responsible for the way one was at ZAR 1, one must have been responsible for the way one was at ZAR 2, and so on. At some point in the chain, there must have been an act of origination of a new causal chain. But this is impossible. Man cannot create himself or his mental states ex nihilo. This argument entails that free will itself is absurd, but not that it is incompatible with determinism. Strawson calls his own view pessimism, but it can be classified as hard incompatibilism. Related philosophical issues, high-level determinism and free will, causal determinism. Causal determinism is the concept that events within a given paradigm are bound by causality in such a way that any state is completely determined by prior states. Causal determinism proposes that there is an unbroken chain of prior occurrences stretching back to the origin of the universe. Causal determinists believe that there is nothing uncaused or self-caused. The most common form of causal determinism is nomological determinism, the notion that the past and the present dictate the future entirely and necessarily by rigid natural laws, that every occurrence results inevitably from prior events. Quantum mechanics poses a serious challenge to this view. Destiny and fate. Destiny or fate is a predetermined course of events. It may be conceived as a predetermined future, whether in general or of an individual. It is a concept based on the belief that there is a fixed natural order to the cosmos. Although often used interchangeably, the words fate and destiny have distinct connotations. Fate generally implies there is a set course which cannot be deviated from, and for which one has no control over. Fate is related to determinism, but makes no specific claim of physical determinism. Even with physical indeterminism, an event could still be fated externally. Destiny likewise is related to determinism, but makes no specific claim of physical determinism. Even with physical indeterminism, an event could still be destined to occur. Destiny implies there is a set course which cannot be deviated from, but does not of itself make any claim with respect to the setting of that course. Free will, if existent, could be the mechanism by which that destined outcome is chosen. Logical determinism. Discussion regarding destiny does not necessitate the existence of a higher power. Logical determinism or determinateness is the notion that all propositions, whether about the past, present, or future, are either true or false. This creates a unique problem for free will given that propositions about the future already have a truth value in the present, and is referred to as the problem of future contingents. Omniscience. Omniscience is the capacity to know everything that there is to know, and is a property often attributed to a created deity. Omniscience implies the existence of destiny. Some authors have claimed that free will cannot coexist with omniscience. One argument asserts that an omniscient creator not only implies destiny but a form of high-level predeterminism such as hard theological determinism or predestination, that they have independently fixed all events and outcomes in the universe in advance. In such a case, even if an individual could have influence over their lower-level physical system, their choices in regard to this cannot be their own. Omniscience features as an incompatible properties argument for the existence of God, known as the argument from free will, and is closely related to other such arguments, for example the incompatibility of omnipotence with a good created deity. Predeterminism. Predeterminism is the idea that all events are determined in advance. Predeterminism is the philosophy that all events of history, past, present and future, have been decided or are known, including human actions. Predeterminism is frequently taken to mean that human actions cannot interfere with the outcomes of a predetermined course of events, and that one's destiny was established externally. The concept of predeterminism is often argued by invoking causal determinism, implying that there is an unbroken chain of prior occurrences stretching back to the origin of the universe. In the case of predeterminism, this chain of events has been pre-established, and human actions cannot interfere with the outcomes of this pre-established chain. Predeterminism can be used to mean such pre-established causal determinism, in which case it is categorized as a specific type of determinism. It can also be used interchangeably with causal determinism, in the context of its capacity to determine future events. Despite this, predeterminism is often considered as independent of causal determinism. The term predeterminism is also frequently used in the context of biology and hereditary, in which case it represents a form of biological determinism. The term predeterminism suggests not just a determining of all events, but the prior and deliberately conscious determining of all events. While determinism usually refers to a naturalistically explainable causality of events, predeterminism seems by definition to suggest a person or a someone, who is controlling or planning the causality of events before they occur and who then perhaps resides beyond the natural, causal universe. Predestination asserts that a supremely powerful being has indeed fixed all events and outcomes in the universe in advance, and is a famous doctrine of the Calvinists in Christian theology. Predestination is often considered a form of hard theological determinism. Predeterminism has therefore been compared to fatalism. Fatalism is the idea that everything is fated to happen, so that humans have no control over their future. Theological determinism. Theological determinism is a form of determinism which states that all events that happen are preordained, or predestined to happen, by a monotheistic deity, or that they are destined to occur given its omniscience. Two forms of theological determinism exist, here referenced as strong and weak theological determinism. The first one, strong theological determinism, is based on the concept of a created deity dictating all events in history. Everything that happens has been predestined to happen by an omniscient, omnipotent divinity. The second form, weak theological determinism, is based on the concept of divine foreknowledge. Because God's omniscience is perfect, what God knows about the future will inevitably happen, which means, consequently, that the future is already fixed. There exist slight variations on the above categorization. Some claim that theological determinism requires predestination of all events and outcomes by the divinity, or that the weaker version does not constitute theological determinism at all. Theological determinism can also be seen as a form of causal determinism, in which the antecedent conditions are the nature and will of God. With respect to free will and the classification of theological compatibilism and compatibilism below, theological determinism is the thesis that God exists and has infallible knowledge of all true propositions including propositions about our future actions, more minimal criteria designed to encapsulate all forms of theological determinism. There are various implications for metaphysical libertarian free will as consequent of theological determinism and its philosophical interpretation. Strong theological determinism is not compatible with metaphysical libertarian free will, and is a form of hard theological determinism. It claims that free will does not exist, and God has absolute control over a person's actions. Hard theological determinism is similar in implication to hard determinism, although it does not invalidate compatibilist free will. Hard theological determinism is a form of theological incompatibilism. Weak theological determinism is either compatible or incompatible with metaphysical libertarian free will depending upon one's philosophical interpretation of omniscience, and as such is interpreted as either a form of hard theological determinism, or as soft theological determinism. Soft theological determinism claims that humans have free will to choose their actions, holding that God, whilst knowing their actions before they happen, does not affect the outcome. God's providence is compatible with voluntary choice. Soft theological determinism is known as theological compatibilism. A rejection of theological determinism is classified as theological incompatibilism also, and is relevant to a more general discussion of free will. The basic argument for theological fatalism in the case of weak theological determinism is as follows. Assume divine foreknowledge or omniscience. Infallible foreknowledge implies destiny. Destiny eliminates alternate possibility, a certain compatibility with metaphysical libertarian free will. This argument is very often accepted as a basis for theological incompatibilism, denying either libertarian free will or divine foreknowledge and therefore theological determinism. On the other hand, theological compatibilism must attempt to find problems with it. The formal version of the argument rests on a number of premises, many of which have received some degree of contention. Theological compatibilist responses have included: deny the truth value of future contingents, as proposed for example by Aristotle. Assert differences in non-temporal knowledge, an approach taken for example by Boethius, Thomas Aquinas, and C.S. Lewis. Deny the principle of alternate possibilities. If you cannot do otherwise when you do an act, you do not act freely. For example, a human observer could in principle have a machine that could detect what will happen in the future, but the existence of this machine or their use of it has no influence on the outcomes of events. In the definition of compatibilism and incompatibilism, the literature often fails to distinguish between physical determinism and higher-level forms of determinism. As such, hard determinism with respect to theological determinism might be classified as hard incompatibilism with respect to physical determinism, or even compatibilism, if not hard determinism itself. By the same principle, metaphysical libertarianism might be classified as compatibilism with respect to theological determinism. If hard theological determinism is accepted, then metaphysical libertarianism is not however possible, and would require reclassification. The mind-body problem. The idea of free will is one aspect of a mind-body problem, that is, consideration of the relation between mind and body. Philosophical models of mind are divided into physical and non-physical expositions. Cartesian dualism holds that the mind is a non-physical substance, the seat of consciousness and intelligence, and raises the question of how mind and body interact. It is suggested that although the two worlds do interact, each retains some measure of autonomy. Under Cartesian dualism, external mind is responsible for bodily action, although unconscious brain activity is often caused by external events. Cartesian dualism implies that the physical world is not deterministic, and in which external mind controls physical events, providing an interpretation of incompatibilist free will. Stemming from Cartesian dualism, a formulation sometimes called interactionalist dualism suggests a two-way interaction, that some physical events cause some mental acts and some mental acts cause some physical events. One modern vision of the possible separation of mind and body is the three-world formulation of Popper. Cartesian dualism and Popper's three worlds are two forms of what is called epistemological pluralism, that is the notion that different epistemological methodologies are necessary to attain a full description of the world. Other forms of epistemological pluralist dualism include psychophysical parallelism and epiphenomenalism. Epistemological pluralism is one view in which the mind-body problem is not reducible to the concepts of the natural sciences. A contrasting approach is called physicalism. Physicalism is a philosophical theory holding that everything which exists is no more extensive than its physical properties. That is, that there are no non-physical substances. Physicalism can be reductive or non-reductive. Reductive physicalism is grounded in the idea that everything in the world can actually be reduced analytically to its fundamental physical, or material, basis. Alternatively, non-reductive physicalism asserts that mental properties form a separate ontological class to physical properties, that mental states are not ontologically reducible to physical states. Although one might suppose that mental states and neurological states are different in kind, that does not rule out the possibility that mental states are correlated with neurological states. In one such construction, anomalous monism, mental events supervene on physical events, describing the emergence of mental properties correlated with physical properties, implying causal reducibility. Non-reductive physicalism is therefore often categorized as property dualism rather than monism, yet other types of property dualism do not adhere to the causal reducibility of mental states. Incompatibilism requires a distinction between the mental and the physical, being a commentary on the incompatibility of physical reality and one's presumably distinct experience of will. Secondarily, metaphysical libertarian free will must assert influence on physical reality, and where mind is responsible for such influence, it must be distinct from body to accomplish this. Both substance and property dualism offer such a distinction, and those particular models thereof which are not causally inert with respect to the physical world provide a basis for illustrating incompatibilist free will. Compatibilism. Compatibilists maintain that determinism is compatible with free will. It may, however, be more accurate to say that compatibilists define free will in a way that allows it to coexist with determinism. Compatibilists believe freedom can be present or absent in a situation for reasons that have nothing to do with metaphysics. For instance, courts of law make judgments about whether individuals are acting under their own free will under certain circumstances without bringing in metaphysics. Similarly, political liberty is a non-metaphysical concept. Likewise, compatibilists define free will as freedom to act according to one's determined motives without hindrance from other individuals. So for example Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, and the Stoic Chrysippus. In contrast, the incompatibilist positions are concerned with a sort of metaphysically free will, which compatibilists claim has never been coherently defined. Compatibilists argue that determinism does not matter. What matters is that individuals' wills are the result of their own desires and are not overridden by some external force. To be a compatibilist, one need not endorse any particular conception of free will, but only deny that determinism is at odds with free will. Although there are various impediments to exercising one's choices, free will does not imply freedom of action. Freedom of choice is logically separate from freedom to implement that choice, although not all writers observe this distinction. Nonetheless, some philosophers have defined free will as the absence of various impediments. Some modern compatibilists, such as Harry Frankfurt and Daniel Dennett, argue free will as simply freely choosing to do what constraints allow one to do. In other words, a coerced agent's choices can still be free if such coercion coincides with the agent's personal intentions and desires. Free will as lack of physical restraint. Most classical compatibilists, such as Thomas Hobbes, claim that a person is acting on the person's own will only when it is the desire of that person to do the act, and also possible for the person to be able to do otherwise, if the person had decided to. Hobbes sometimes attributes such compatibilist freedom to each individual and not to some abstract notion of will, asserting, for example, that no liberty can be inferred to the will, desire, or inclination, but the liberty of the man, which consisteth in this, that he finds no stop, in doing what he has the will, desire, or inclination to do. In articulating this crucial proviso, David Hume writes, this hypothetical liberty is universally allowed to belong to everyone who is not a prisoner and in chains. Similarly, Voltaire, in his Dictionnaire philosophique, claimed that liberty then is only and can be only the power to do what one will. He asked, would you have everything at the pleasure of a million blind caprices? For him, free will or liberty is only the power of acting. What is this power? It is the effect of the constitution and present state of our organs. Free will as a psychological state. 13th-century philosopher Thomas Aquinas viewed humans as pre-programmed to seek certain goals, but able to choose between routes to achieve these goals. In facing these choices, humans are governed by intellect, will, and passions. The will is the primary mover of all the powers of the soul. And it is also the efficient cause of motion in the body. Choice falls into 5 stages: intellectual consideration of whether an objective is desirable, intellectual consideration of means of attaining the objective, will arrives at an intent to pursue the objective, will and intellect jointly decide upon choice of means, will elects execution. Free will enters as follows: free will is an appetitive power, that is, not a cognitive power of intellect. He states that judgment concludes and terminates counsel. Now counsel is terminated, first, by the judgment of reason. Secondly, by the acceptation of the appetite, that is, the free will. Aquinas' compatibilist view is defended thus: free will is the cause of its own movement, because by his free will man moves himself to act. But it does not of necessity belong to liberty that what is free should be the first cause of itself, as neither for one thing to be cause of another need it be the first cause. God, therefore, is the first cause, who moves causes both natural and voluntary. And just as by moving natural causes he does not prevent their acts being natural, so by moving voluntary causes he does not deprive their actions of being voluntary, but rather is he the cause of this very thing in them. For he operates in each thing according to its own nature. Some explanations of free will focus on the internal causality of the mind with respect to higher-order brain processing, the interaction between conscious and unconscious brain activity. The notion of levels of decision is presented in a different manner by Frankfurt. Frankfurt argues for a version of compatibilism called the hierarchical mesh. The idea is that an individual can have conflicting desires at a first-order level and also have a desire about the various first-order desires to the effect that one of the desires prevails over the others. A person's will is identified with their effective first-order desire, that is, the one they act on, and this will is free if it was the desire the person wanted to act upon, that is, the person's second-order desire was effective. So, for example, there are wanton addicts, unwilling addicts, and willing addicts. All 3 groups may have the conflicting first-order desires to want to take the drug they are addicted to and to not want to take it. The first group, wanton addicts, have no second-order desire not to take the drug. The second group, unwilling addicts, have a second-order desire not to take the drug, while the third group, willing addicts, have a second-order desire to take it. According to Frankfurt, the members of the first group are devoid of will and therefore are no longer persons. The members of the second group freely desire not to take the drug, but their will is overcome by the addiction. Finally, the members of the third group willingly take the drug they are addicted to. Frankfurt's theory can ramify to any number of levels. Critics of the theory point out that there is no certainty that conflicts will not arise even at the higher-order levels of desire and preference. Others argue that Frankfurt offers no adequate explanation of how the various levels in the hierarchy mesh together. Free will as unpredictability. In Elbow Room, Dennett presents an argument for a compatibilist theory of free will, which he further elaborated in the book Freedom Evolves. The basic reasoning is that, if one excludes God, an infinitely powerful demon, and other such possibilities, then because of chaos and epistemic limits on the precision of our knowledge of the current state of the world, the future is ill-defined for all finite beings. The only well-defined things are expectations. The ability to do otherwise only makes sense when dealing with these expectations, and not with some unknown and unknowable future. According to Dennett, because individuals have the ability to act differently from what anyone expects, free will can exist. Incompatibilists claim the problem with this idea is that we may be mere automata responding in predictable ways to stimuli in our environment. Therefore, all of our actions are controlled by forces outside ourselves, or by random chance. More sophisticated analyses of compatibilist free will have been offered, as have other critiques. In the philosophy of decision theory, a fundamental question is, from the standpoint of statistical outcomes, to what extent do the choices of a conscious being have the ability to influence the future? Newcomb's paradox and other philosophical problems pose questions about free will and predictable outcomes of choices. Related philosophical issues, the physical mind. Compatibilist models of free will often consider deterministic relationships as discoverable in the physical world. Cognitive naturalism is a physicalist approach to studying human consciousness in which mind is simply part of nature, perhaps merely a feature of many very complex self-programming feedback systems, and so must be studied by the methods of empirical science, for example, behavioral science and the cognitive sciences like neuroscience and cognitive psychology. Cognitive naturalism stresses the role of neurological sciences. Overall brain health, substance dependence, depression, and various personality disorders clearly influence mental activity, and their impact upon volition also is important. For example, an addict may experience a conscious desire to escape addiction, but be unable to do so. The will is disconnected from the freedom to act. This situation is related to an abnormal production and distribution of dopamine in the brain. The neuroscience of free will places restrictions on both compatibilist and incompatibilist free will conceptions. Compatibilist models adhere to models of mind in which mental activity can be reduced to physical activity without any change in physical outcome. Although compatibilism is generally aligned to physicalism, some compatibilist models describe the natural occurrences of deterministic deliberation in the brain in terms of the first-person perspective of the conscious agent performing the deliberation. Such an approach has been considered a form of identity dualism. A description of how conscious experience might affect brains has been provided in which the experience of conscious free will is the first-person perspective of the neural correlates of choosing. Other views. Some philosophers' views are difficult to categorize as either compatibilist or incompatibilist, hard determinist or libertarian. For example, Ted Honderich holds the view that determinism is true, compatibilism and incompatibilism are both false, and the real problem lies elsewhere. Honderich maintains that determinism is true because quantum phenomena are not events or things that can be located in space and time, but are abstract entities. Further, even if they were micro-level events, they do not seem to have any relevance to how the world is at the macroscopic level. He maintains that incompatibilism is false because, even if indeterminism is true, incompatibilists have not provided, and cannot provide, an adequate account of origination. He rejects compatibilism because it, like incompatibilism, assumes a single, fundamental notion of freedom. There are really two notions of freedom: voluntary action and origination. Both notions are required to explain freedom of will and responsibility. Both determinism and indeterminism are threats to such freedom. To abandon these notions of freedom would be to abandon moral responsibility. On the one side, we have our intuitions. On the other, the scientific facts. The new problem is how to resolve this conflict. Two-stage models. In 1884, William James described a two-stage model of free will. In the first stage, the mind develops random alternative possibilities for action, and in the second, an adequately determined will selects one option. A number of other thinkers have since refined this idea, including Henri Poincaré, copyright, Arthur Holly Compton, Karl Popper, Henry Margenau, Robert Kane, Alfred Meal, Bob Doyle and Martin Heisenberg. Each of these models tries to reconcile libertarian free will with the existence of irreducible chance, which threatens to make an agent's decision random, thus denying the control needed for responsibility. If a single event is caused by chance, then logically indeterminism would be true. For centuries, philosophers have said this would undermine the very possibility of certain knowledge. Some go to the extreme of saying that real chance would make the whole state of the world totally independent of any earlier states. Some Stoics are reported to have said that a single uncaused cause could destroy the universe. James said most philosophers have an antipathy to chance. His contemporary John Fiske described the absurd decisions that would be made if chance were real, and if volitions arise without cause. In modern times, J.J.C. Smart has described the problem of admitting indeterminism, as assigning the cause of action to quantum mechanical randomness and therefore impairing rather than granting our freedom. The challenge for two-stage models is to admit some indeterminism but not permit it to produce random actions, as determinists fear. And of course a model must limit determinism but not eliminate it as some libertarians think necessary. Two-stage models limit the contribution of random chance to the generation of alternative possibilities for action. But note that, in recent years, compatibilist analytic philosophers following Harry Frankfurt have denied the existence of alternative possibilities. They develop Frankfurt-type examples in which they argue an agent is free even though no alternative possibilities exist, or the agent is prevented at the last moment by neuroscientific demons from doing otherwise. Free will as an illusion. A Euro-OE experience teaches us no less clearly than reason, that men believe themselves free, simply because they are conscious of their actions, and unconscious of the causes whereby those actions are determined. A Euro-B de Spinoza Ethics, David Hume discussed the possibility that the entire debate about free will is nothing more than a merely verbal issue. He suggested that it might be accounted for by a false sensation or seeming experience, which is associated with many of our actions when we perform them. On reflection, we realize that they were necessary and determined all along. Arthur Schopenhauer put the puzzle of free will and moral responsibility in these terms. Everyone believes himself, a priori, perfectly free even in his individual actions, and thinks that at every moment he can commence another manner of life. But a posteriori, through experience, he finds to his astonishment that he is not free, but subjected to necessity, that in spite of all his resolutions and reflections he does not change his conduct, and that from the beginning of his life to the end of it, he must carry out the very character which he himself condemns. In his essay on the freedom of the will, Schopenhauer stated, "You can do what you will, but in any given moment of your life you can will only one definite thing and absolutely nothing other than that one thing." According to Schopenhauer, phenomena do not have free will. However, will, urging, craving, striving, wanting, and desiring as noumenon is free. Free will as moral imagination. Rudolf Steiner, who collaborated in a complete edition of Arthur Schopenhauer's work, wrote The Philosophy of Freedom, which focuses on the problem of free will. Steiner initially divides this into the two aspects of freedom, freedom of thought and freedom of action. The controllable and uncontrollable aspects of decision-making thereby are made logically separable, as pointed out in the introduction. This separation of will from action has a very long history, going back at least as far as Stoicism and the teachings of Chrysippus, who separated external antecedent causes from the internal disposition receiving this cause. Steiner then argues that inner freedom is achieved when we bridge the gap between our sensory impressions, which reflect the outer appearance of the world, and our thoughts, which give us access to the inner nature of the world. Acknowledging the many influences on our choice, he points to the impact of our becoming aware of just these determinants. Outer freedom is attained by permeating our deeds with moral imagination. Steiner aims to show that these two aspects of inner and outer freedom are integral to one another, and that true freedom is only achieved when they are united. Free will as a pragmatically useful concept. William James' views were ambivalent. While he believed in free will on ethical grounds, he did not believe that there was evidence for it on scientific grounds, nor did his own introspections support it. Moreover, he did not accept incompatibilism as formulated below. He did not believe that the indeterminism of human actions was a prerequisite of moral responsibility. In his work Pragmatism, he wrote that instinct and utility between them can safely be trusted to carry on the social business of punishment and praise regardless of metaphysical theories. He did believe that indeterminism is important as a doctrine of relief. It allows for the view that, although the world may be in many respects a bad place, it may, through individuals' actions, become a better one. Determinism, he argued, undermines meliorism. The idea that progress is a real concept leading to improvement in the world. Free will and views of causality. In 1739, David Hume in his A Treatise of Human Nature approached free will via the notion of causality. It was his position that causality was a mental construct used to explain the repeated association of events, and that one must examine more closely the relation between things regularly succeeding one another and things that result in other things. According to Hume, causation is on weak grounds, Once we realize that a OEA must bring about euro is tantamount merely to a OE due to their constant conjunction, we are psychologically certain that B will follow or euro, then we are left with a very weak notion of necessity. In the 1780s Immanuel Kant suggested at a minimum our decision processes with moral implications lie outside the reach of everyday causality, and lie outside the rules governing material objects. There is a sharp difference between moral judgments and judgments of fact. Moral judgments must be a priori judgments. Freeman introduces what he calls circular causality to allow for the contribution of self-organizing dynamics, the formation of macroscopic population dynamics that shapes the patterns of activity of the contributing individuals, applicable to interactions between neurons and neural masses, and between the behaving animal and its environment. In this view, mind and neurological functions are tightly coupled in a situation where feedback between collective actions and individual subsystems jointly decide upon the behavior of both. In science, physics, early scientific thought often portrayed the universe as deterministic for example in the thought of Democritus or the car va cans and some thinkers claimed that the simple process of gathering sufficient information would allow them to predict future events with perfect accuracy. Modern science, on the other hand, is a mixture of deterministic and stochastic theories. Quantum mechanics predicts events only in terms of probabilities, casting doubt on whether the universe is deterministic at all. Current physical theories cannot resolve the question of whether determinism is true of the world, being very far from a potential theory of everything, and open to many different interpretations. Assuming that an indeterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics is correct, one may still object that such indeterminism is for all practical purposes confined to microscopic phenomena. This is not always the case. Many macroscopic phenomena are based on quantum effects. For instance, some hardware random number generators work by amplifying quantum effects into practically usable signals. A more significant question is whether the indeterminism of quantum mechanics allows for the traditional idea of free will. If a person's action is however only result of complete quantum randomness, and mental processes as experienced have no influence on the probabilistic outcomes, this in itself would mean that such traditional free will does not exist. Under the assumption of physicalism, it has been argued that the laws of quantum mechanics provide a complete probabilistic account of the motion of particles, regardless of whether or not free will exists. Physicist Stephen Hawking describes such ideas in his 2010 book The Grand Design. According to Hawking, these findings from quantum mechanics suggest that humans are sorts of complicated biological machines. Although our behavior is impossible to predict perfectly in practice, free will is just an illusion. In other words, Hawking thinks that only compatibilistic free will is possible based on the data. Erwin Schrödinger, a Nobel laureate in physics and one of the founders of quantum mechanics, came to a different conclusion than Hawking. Near the end of his 1944 essay titled What is Life? He says that there is incontrovertible direct experience that humans have free will. He also states that the human body is wholly or at least partially determined, leading him to conclude that I am the person, if any, who controls the motion of the atoms according to the laws of nature. He explains this position on free will by appealing to a notion of self that is emergent from the entire collection of atoms in his body, and other convictions about conscious experience. However, he also qualifies the conclusion as necessarily subjective in its philosophical implications. Genetics, like physicists, biologists have frequently addressed questions related to free will. One of the most heated debates in biology is that of nature versus nurture, concerning the relative importance of genetics and biology as compared to culture and environment in human behavior. The view of many researchers is that many human behaviors can be explained in terms of humans' brains, genes, and evolutionary histories. This point of view raises the fear that such attribution makes it impossible to hold others responsible for their actions. Steven Pinker's view is that fear of determinism in the context of genetics and evolution is a mistake, that it is a confusion of explanation with exculpation. Responsibility doesn't require that behavior be uncaused, as long as behavior responds to praise and blame. Moreover, it is not certain that environmental determination is any less threatening to free will than genetic determination. Neuroscience. It has become possible to study the living brain, and researchers can now watch the brain's decision-making process at work. A seminal experiment in this field was conducted by Benjamin Libet in the 1980s, in which he asked each subject to choose a random moment to flick her wrist while he measured the associated activity in her brain. In particular, the buildup of electrical signal called the readiness potential. Although it was well known that the readiness potential caused and preceded the physical action, Libet asked whether it could be recorded before the conscious intention to move. To determine when subjects felt the intention to move, he asked them to watch the second hand of a clock. After making a movement, the volunteer reported the time on the clock when they first felt the conscious intention to move. This became known as Libet's W time. Libet found that the unconscious brain activity of the readiness potential leading up to subjects' movements began approximately half a second before the subject was aware of a conscious intention to move. These studies of the timing between actions and the conscious decision bear upon the role of the brain in understanding free will. A subject's declaration of intention to move a finger appears after the brain has begun to implement the action, suggesting to some that unconsciously the brain has made the decision before the conscious mental act to do so. Some believe the implication is that free will was not involved in the decision and is an illusion. The first of these experiments reported the brain registered activity related to the move about 0.2 s before movement onset. However, these authors also found that awareness of action was anticipatory to activity in the muscle underlying the movement. The entire process resulting in action involves more steps than just the onset of brain activity. The bearing of these results upon notions of free will appears complex. Some argue that placing the question of free will in the context of motor control is too narrow. The objection is that the timescales involved in motor control are very short, and motor control involves a great deal of unconscious action, with much physical movement entirely unconscious. On that basis, free will cannot be squeezed into time frames of 150–350 milliseconds. Free will is a longer-term phenomenon, and free will is a higher-level activity that cannot be captured in a description of neural activity or of muscle activation. The bearing of timing experiments upon free will is still under discussion. More studies have since been conducted, including some that try to support Libet's original findings, suggest that the cancelling or veto of an action may first arise subconsciously as well, explain the underlying brain structures involved, suggest models that explain the relationship between conscious intention and action. Neurology and psychiatry. In several brain-related conditions, individuals cannot entirely control their own actions. Though the existence of such conditions does not directly refute the existence of free will, the study of such conditions, like the neuroscientific studies above, is valuable in developing models of how the brain may construct our experience of free will. For example, people with Tourette syndrome and related tic disorders make involuntary movements and utterances, called tics, despite the fact that they would prefer not to do so when it is socially inappropriate. Tics are described as semi-voluntary or involuntary, because they are not strictly involuntary. They may be experienced as a voluntary response to an unwanted, premonitory urge. Tics are experienced as irresistible and must eventually be expressed. People with Tourette syndrome are sometimes able to suppress their tics for limited periods, but doing so often results in an explosion of tics afterward. The control exerted may merely postpone and exacerbate the ultimate expression of the tic. In alien hand syndrome, the afflicted individual's limb will produce meaningful behaviors without the intention of the subject. The affected limb effectively demonstrates a will of its own. The sense of agency does not emerge in conjunction with the overt appearance of the purposeful act, even though the sense of ownership in relationship to the body part is maintained. This phenomenon corresponds with an impairment in the premotor mechanism manifested temporally by the appearance of the readiness potential recordable on the scalp several hundred milliseconds before the overt appearance of a spontaneous willed movement. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging with specialized multivariate analyses to study the temporal dimension in the activation of the cortical network associated with voluntary movement in human subjects, an anterior to posterior sequential activation process beginning in the supplementary motor area on the medial surface of the frontal lobe and progressing to the primary motor cortex and then to parietal cortex has been observed. The sense of agency thus appears to normally emerge in conjunction with this orderly sequential network activation incorporating premotor association cortices together with primary motor cortex. In particular, the supplementary motor complex on the medial surface of the frontal lobe appears to activate prior to primary motor cortex, presumably associated with a preparatory pre-movement process. In a recent study using functional magnetic resonance imaging, alien movements were characterized by a relatively isolated activation of the primary motor cortex contralateral to the alien hand, while voluntary movements of the same body part included the concomitant activation of motor association cortex associated with the premotor process. The clinical definition requires feeling that one limb is foreign or has a will of its own, together with observable involuntary motor activity. This syndrome is often a result of damage to the corpus callosum either when it is severed to treat intractable epilepsy or due to a stroke. The standard neurological explanation is that the felt will reported by the speaking left hemisphere does not correspond with the actions performed by the non-speaking right hemisphere, thus suggesting that the two hemispheres may have independent senses of will. Similarly, one of the most important diagnostic symptoms of schizophrenia is the delusion of being controlled by an external force. People with schizophrenia will sometimes report that, although they are acting in the world, they did not initiate, or will, the particular actions they performed. This is sometimes likened to being a robot controlled by someone else. Although the neural mechanisms of schizophrenia are not yet clear, one influential hypothesis is that there is a breakdown in brain systems that compare motor commands with the feedback received from the body, leading to attendant hallucinations and delusions of control. Determinism and emergent behavior. The notion of emergence refers to cooperative system-wide responses, best understood on a global basis rather than one of individual components. This idea has wide application, including that to societal structures and to the brain itself. There are several schools of thought regarding emergence, and these have implications for free will. The school of strong emergence takes the view that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and suggests a downward causation is possible, that is, phenomena at a larger scale level of organization can exert causal influence on a smaller scale level. From this stance, the mind is an emergent property of the brain that can control the brain itself, and free will is one such phenomenon. Opposite views are nominal emergence and weak emergence. Both deny the possibility of downward causation and see emergence as an expression of events that fundamentally are microscopically generated. The difference between nominal and weak emergence is only in the complexity of the connection to the underlying microscopic behavior. In some generative philosophies of cognitive sciences and evolutionary psychology, free will is assumed not to exist. However, an illusion of free will is created, within this theoretical context, due to the generation of infinite or computationally complex behavior from the interaction of a finite set of rules and parameters. Thus, the unpredictability of the emerging behavior from deterministic processes leads to a perception of free will, even though free will as an ontological entity is assumed not to exist. In this picture, even if the behavior could be computed ahead of time, no way of doing so is simpler than just observing the outcome of the brain's own computations. As an illustration, some strategy board games have rigorous rules in which no information is hidden from either player and no random events occur in the game. Nevertheless, strategy games like chess and especially Go, with its simple deterministic rules, can have an extremely large number of unpredictable moves. By analogy, emergentists suggest that the experience of free will emerges from the interaction of finite rules and deterministic parameters that generate infinite and unpredictable behavior. Yet, if all these events were accounted for, and there were a known way to evaluate these events, the seemingly unpredictable behavior would become predictable. Cellular automata and the generative sciences can model emergent processes of social behavior on this philosophy. In their book The Grand Design, Hawking and Mladino suggest a thought experiment in which one encounters an alien that may be a robot. Today robots can be made that adapt their responses to their environment through self-programming, so-called intelligent robots. Much of the description of these machines seems parallel to human behavior, although technology has still not reached sufficient complexity to make a strong case for the similarities. Is such a machine deterministic? We cannot predict the machine's exact behavior without a complete knowledge of its personal history with its environment, the reliability of its components, and its present state of programming, uncertainties in which limit us to probabilistic statements. Groups of cooperating robots also are envisioned. One can conjecture that some such groups would evolve following a Darwinian scheme, not only an interest of engineers, but a recurrent topic of science fiction. Experimental psychology. Experimental psychology's contributions to the free will debate have come primarily through social psychologist Daniel Wenner's work on conscious will. In his book, The Illusion of Conscious Will, Wenner summarizes what he believes is empirical evidence supporting the view that human perception of conscious control is an illusion. Wenner summarizes some empirical evidence that may suggest that the perception of conscious control is open to modification. Wenner observes that one event is inferred to have caused a second event when two requirements are met: the first event immediately precedes the second event, and the first event is consistent with having caused the second event. For example, if a person hears an explosion and sees a tree fall down, that person is likely to infer that the explosion caused the tree to fall over. However, if the explosion occurs after the tree falls down, or rather than an explosion, the person hears the ring of a telephone, then that person is not likely to infer that either noise caused the tree to fall down. Wenner has applied this principle to the inferences people make about their own conscious will. People typically experience a thought that is consistent with a behavior, and then they observe themselves performing this behavior. As a result, people infer that their thoughts must have caused the observed behavior. However, Wenner has been able to manipulate people's thoughts and behaviors so as to conform to or violate the two requirements for causal inference. Through such work, Wenner has been able to show that people often experience conscious will over behaviors that they have not, in fact, caused euro, and conversely, that people can be led to experience a lack of will over behaviors they did cause. For instance, priming subjects with information about an effect increases the probability that a person falsely believes is the cause. The implication for such work is that the perception of conscious will is not tethered to the execution of actual behaviors, but is inferred from various cues through an intricate mental process, authorship processing. Although many interpret this work as a blow against the argument for free will, both psychologists and philosophers have criticized Wenner's theories. Emily Pronin has argued that the subjective experience of free will is supported by the introspection illusion. This is the tendency for people to trust the reliability of their own introspections while distrusting the introspections of other people. The theory implies that people will more readily attribute free will to themselves rather than others. This prediction has been confirmed by 3 of Pronin and Kugler's experiments. When college students were asked about personal decisions in their own and their roommates' lives, they regarded their own choices as less predictable. Staff at a restaurant described their co-workers' lives as more determined than their own lives. When weighing up the influence of different factors on behavior, students gave desires and intentions the strongest weight for their own behavior, but rated personality traits as most predictive of other people. Psychologists have shown that reducing a person's belief in free will makes them less helpful and more aggressive. This may occur because the subject loses a sense of self-efficacy. Caveats have however been identified in studying a subject's awareness of mental events, in that the process of introspection itself may alter the experience. Believing in free will. In recent years, free will belief in individuals has been analyzed with respect to traits in social behavior. In general, the concept of free will research to date in this context has been that of the incompatibilist, or more specifically, the libertarian, that is freedom from determinism. What people believe, whether people naturally adhere to an incompatibilist model of free will, has been questioned in the research. Eddie Namias has found that incompatibilism is not intuitive it was not adhered to, in that determinism does not negate belief in moral responsibility. Edward Coakley has found that incompatibilism is intuitive it was naturally adhered to, in that determinism does indeed negate belief in moral responsibility in general. Joshua Noby and Sean Nichols have proposed that incompatibilism may or may not be intuitive, and that it is dependent to some large degree upon the circumstances. Whether or not the crime incites an emotional response for example if it involves harming another human being. They found that belief in free will is a cultural universal, and that the majority of participants say that our universe is indeterministic and moral responsibility is not compatible with determinism. Studies indicate that people's belief in free will is inconsistent. Emily Pronin and Matthew Kugler found that people believe they have more free will than others. Studies also reveal a correlation between someone's likelihood of accepting a deterministic model of mind, and their personality type. For example, Adam Feltz and Edward Coakley found that people of an extrovert personality type are more likely to dissociate belief in determinism from belief in moral responsibility. Roy Baumeister and colleagues reviewed literature on the psychological effects of a belief in free will. The first part of their analysis was not meant to discover which types of free will actually exist. The researchers instead sought to identify what other people believe, how many people believed it, and the effects of those beliefs. Baumeister found that most people tend to believe in a sort of naive compatibilistic free will. The researchers also found that people consider acts more free, when they involve a person opposing external forces, planning, or making random actions. Notably, the last behavior, random actions, may not be possible. When participants attempt to perform tasks in a random manner, their behavior betrays many patterns. Effects of the belief itself. Baumeister and colleagues found that provoking disbelief in free will seems to cause various negative effects. The authors concluded, in their paper, that it is belief in determinism that causes those negative effects. This may not be a very justified conclusion, however. First of all, free will can at least refer to either libertarian free will or compatibilistic free will. Having participants read articles that simply disprove free will is unlikely to increase their understanding of determinism, or the compatibilistic free will that it still permits. In other words, provoking disbelief in free will probably causes a belief in fatalism. As discussed earlier in this article, compatibilistic free will is illustrated by statements like "my choices have causes," and "an effect so I affect my future," whereas fatalism is more like "my choices have causes, but no effect I am powerless." Fatalism, then, may be what threatens people's sense of self-efficacy. Lay people should not confuse fatalism with determinism, and yet even professional philosophers occasionally confuse the two. It is thus likely that the negative consequences below can be accounted for by participants developing a belief in fatalism when experiments attack belief in free will. To test the effects of belief in determinism, future studies would need to provide articles that do not simply attack free will, but instead focus on explaining determinism and compatibilism. Some studies have been conducted indicating that people react strongly to the way in which mental determinism is described, when reconciling it with moral responsibility. Eddie Namias has noted that when people's actions are framed with respect to their beliefs and desires, they are more likely to dissociate determinism from moral responsibility. Various social behavioral traits have been correlated with the belief in deterministic models of mind, some of which involved the experimental subjection of individuals to libertarian and deterministic perspectives. After researchers provoked volunteers to disbelieve in free will, participants lied, cheated, and stole more. Kathleen Vogt has found that those whose belief in free will had been eroded were more likely to cheat. In a study conducted by Roy Baumeister, after participants read an article arguing against free will, they were more likely to lie about their performance on a test where they would be rewarded with cash. Provoking a rejection of free will has also been associated with increased aggression and less helpful behavior as well as mindless conformity. Disbelief in free will can even cause people to feel less guilt about transgressions against others. Baumeister and colleagues also note that volunteers disbelieving in free will are less capable of counterfactual thinking. This is worrying because counterfactual thinking is an important part of learning from one's choices, including those that harmed others. Again, this cannot be taken to mean that belief in determinism is to blame. These are the results we would expect from increasing people's belief in fatalism. Along similar lines, Tyler Stillman has found that belief in free will predicts better job performance. In Eastern philosophy, in Hindu philosophy, the 6 orthodox schools of thought in Hindu philosophy do not agree with each other entirely on the question of free will. For the Samkhya, for instance, matter is without any freedom, and soul lacks any ability to control the unfolding of matter. The only real freedom consists in realizing the ultimate separateness of matter and self. For the Yoga school, only Ishvara is truly free, and its freedom is also distinct from all feelings, thoughts, actions, or wills, and is thus not at all a freedom of will. The metaphysics of the Nyaya and Vaisheshika schools strongly suggest a belief in determinism, but do not seem to make explicit claims about determinism or free will. A quotation from Swami Vivekananda, a Vedantist, offers a good example of the worry about free will in the Hindu tradition. Therefore we see at once that there cannot be any such thing as free will. The very words are a contradiction, because will is what we know, and everything that we know is within our universe, and everything within our universe is molded by conditions of time, space and causality. To acquire freedom we have to get beyond the limitations of this universe. It cannot be found here. However, the preceding quote has often been misinterpreted as Vivekananda implying that everything is predetermined. What Vivekananda actually meant by lack of free will was that the will was not free, because it was heavily influenced by the law of cause and effect. The will is not free, it is a phenomenon bound by cause and effect, but there is something behind the will which is free. Vivekananda never said things were absolutely determined and placed emphasis on the power of conscious choice to alter one's past karma. It is the coward and the fool who says this is his fate. But it is the strong man who stands up and says I will make my own fate. In Buddhist philosophy, Buddhism accepts both freedom and determinism, but rejects the idea of an agent, and thus the idea that freedom is a free will belonging to an agent. According to the Buddha, there is free action, there is retribution, but I see no agent that passes out from one set of momentary elements into another one, except the connection of those elements. Buddhists believe in neither absolute free will, nor determinism. It preaches a middle doctrine, named pratitya samutpada in Sanskrit, which is often translated as interdependent arising. This theory is also called conditioned genesis, or dependent origination. It teaches that every volition is a conditioned action as a result of ignorance. In part, it states that free will is inherently conditioned and not free to begin with. It is also part of the theory of karma in Buddhism. The concept of karma in Buddhism is different from the notion of karma in Hinduism. In Buddhism, the idea of karma is much less deterministic. The Buddhist notion of karma is primarily focused on the cause and effect of the moral actions in this life, while in Hinduism the concept of karma is more often connected with determining one's destiny in future lives. In Buddhism it is taught that the idea of absolute freedom of choice is unwise, because it denies the reality of one's physical needs and circumstances. Equally incorrect is the idea that humans have no choice in life or that their lives are predetermined. To deny freedom would be to deny the efforts of Buddhists to make moral progress. Publicachartavada, the belief that all happiness and suffering arise from previous actions, is considered a wrong view according to Buddhist doctrines. Because Buddhists also reject agenthood, the traditional compatibilist strategies are close to them as well. Instead, the Buddhist philosophical strategy is to examine the metaphysics of causality. Ancient India had many heated arguments about the nature of causality with Jains, Nyayists, Samkhyists, Karvakans, and Buddhists all taking slightly different lines. In many ways, the Buddhist position is closer to a theory of conditionality than a theory of causality, especially as it is expounded by Nagarjuna in the Mahamadhyama Karika. In Islamic philosophy, according to Islamic creed, it is Goda unregistered trademark will which has determined that this particular species of creation, known as man, has the ability to follow guidance or go astray, according to his own free choice, not as a result of any compulsion. This is how God lets whomever he wills go astray and how he helps whomever he wills follow the straight path. His will helps everyone who strives to implement divine guidance, while it abandons and lets go astray anyone who stubbornly rejects guidance. It does no injustice to anyone. A human being may follow guidance or may allow himself to go astray. Both possibilities are part of his nature. Both directions have been created by God unregistered trademark S will. Similarly, the consequences that follow upon a persona unregistered trademark S choice to follow one way or the other are also determined by God unregistered trademark S will, which is active, absolute. Reckoning, judgment and reward are based on Mani unregistered trademark S choice of the course he follows. That choice is of his own making, although the ability to choose either has been planted in him by God unregistered trademark S will. In other theology, the theological doctrine of divine foreknowledge is often alleged to be in conflict with free will, particularly in Reformed circles. For if God knows exactly what will happen, right down to every choice, that calls into question the status of choices as free. If God has timelessly true knowledge about one's choices, this seems to constrain individual freedom. This problem is related to the Aristotelian problem of the sea battle: tomorrow there will or will not be a sea battle. If there will be one, then it seems that it was true yesterday that there would be one. Then it would be necessary that the sea battle will occur. If there won't be one, then by similar reasoning, it is necessary that it won't occur. This means that the future, whatever it is completely fixed by past truths or true propositions about the future. However, some philosophers follow William of Ockham in holding that necessity and possibility are defined with respect to a given point in time and a given matrix of empirical circumstances, and so something that is merely possible from the perspective of one observer may be necessary from the perspective of an omniscient. Some philosophers follow Philo of Alexandria, a philosopher known for his homocentrism, in holding that free will is a feature of a human soul, and thus that non-human animals lack free will. Some views in Jewish philosophy stress that free will is a product of the intrinsic human soul, using the word neshama, but the ability to make a free choice is through yechida, the part of the soul that is united with God, the only being that is not hindered by or dependent on cause and effect. While there are other views of free will in Judaism, most share the same basic Kabbalah principles. In Islam, the theological issue is not usually how to reconcile free will with God's foreknowledge, but with God's Jabr, or divine commanding power. Al-Ash'ari developed an acquisition, or dual agency form of compatibilism, in which human free will and divine Jabr were both asserted, and which became a cornerstone of the dominant Ash'ari position. In Shia Islam, Ash'ari's understanding of a higher balance toward predestination is challenged by most theologians. Free will, according to Islamic doctrine, is the main factor for man's accountability in his/her actions throughout life. Actions taken by people exercising free will are counted on the Day of Judgment because they are their own, however the free will happens with the permission of God. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard claimed that divine omnipotence cannot be separated from divine goodness. As a truly omnipotent and good being, God could create beings with true freedom over God. Furthermore, God would voluntarily do so because the greatest good, which can be done for a being, greater than anything else that one can do for it, is to be truly free. Alvin Plantinga's free will defense is a contemporary expansion of this theme, adding how God, free will, and evil are consistent. See also: References, Notes, Bibliography. Further reading. Other sources. External links. Fate, Freedom and Neuroscience, a debate on whether free will is an illusion and predetermined by the Institute of Art and Ideas, featuring Oxford neuroscientist Nathan Rodden, psychiatrist and broadcaster Mark Salter, and LSE philosopher Christina Michault. Free Will at Phil Papers, Free Will at the Indiana Philosophy Ontology Project, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy Entries, Foreknowledge and Free Will by Norman Swartz, Free Will by Kevin Timp, Medieval Theories of Free Will by Colleen McCluskey, Middle Knowledge by John D. Lying. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy Entries, Free Will by Timothy O'Connor, Incompatibilism by Randolph Clark, Divine Foreknowledge and Free Will by Linda Zaurzebski. Free Will and Determinism at DMOZ, Free Will by Galen Strawson in Routledge Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Free Will in Catholic Encyclopedia, the Determinism and Freedom Philosophy website edited by Ted Honderich, Freedom and the Laws of Nature by Stephen Horst, The Skeptic's Dictionary on Free Will, Jonathan Edwards's Freedom of the Will, slightly modified for easier reading. This article incorporates material from the Citizendium article Free Will, which is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 unported license but not under the GFDL.